On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the motor tanker Mercer Street was attacked by a pair of drones, one of which exploded on the bridge of the vessel, killing two crew members on board. The ship is Liberian flag, operated by an Israeli company, Japanese owned, and it's believed that the perpetrators are the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Hi, I'm Sal Mercogliano, Associate Professor of History at Campbell University, a former merchant mariner and an adjunct instructor in maritime industry policy at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. What is going on off the coast of Oman right now with this attack on the Mercer Street? A tanker out of Dar es Salaam, down at the very southeastern tip of Africa, that was en route to Fujairah in the state of Oman. So there's a lot to unpack here. And so there's a lot of news flying around about this. One of the things I want to do is always is take a few minutes and kind of go through the history. What do we know about the event? Unpack it a little bit and put it into the context of what is going on in terms of global shipping right now. So if you hit Mercer Street right now in AIS on marine traffic, you get this ping right here. This is her leaving Dar es Salaam over a week ago on the 21st, due up to Fujairah today on the 30th. She went dark on her AIS, and that is not unusual right now. There has been a spat of attacks on ships associated with the state of Israel by Iran. At the same time, Iranian vessels have been being hit by the Israelis. And this has been going on for a long time. Understand the context of what's going on between Iran and Israel. Iran has problems with literally all its neighbors. It is a minority within Islam, it's a Shia sect. So it has problems with Saudi Arabia. It has problems for Israel with obvious reasons, it not being Islamic, but not only that, but the fact that Israel controls Jerusalem, one of three holy sites in the Islamic faith. The other two, Mecca, Medina, are being housed or within the confines of Saudi Arabia, which are largely Sunni. And the Shia, and more importantly, the Iranians, have had basically an ongoing fight with Israel for a long time. They don't believe Israel should exist. They also fund terrorism along the Israeli border, out of Lebanon, out of Jordan, out of Syria. And so there's been this long, long history between the two. That has manifested itself in a series of attacks recently on shipping. So let's talk about this. So this came out of Dryad Global right here, their Channel 16 report. Channel 16, if you don't know, is the international channel you monitor on board ships with VHF. That's what they call their channel. And probably one of the best breakdowns on the attack right here. There's another one I'm going to show you from the Associated Press, which is really, really good. So this one talks about the attack. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of give you the details on that right here. So, a hostile attempt by the Iranian-backed Houthis to attack a Saudi. Oh, excuse me. This is the Saudi commercial ship that was attacked. This is another vessel that was actually attacked, and I'm going to come back to this one here in a minute. That's another attack that actually took place. Here's the attack right here. This is the attack on the ship we want, the motor tanker Mercer Street. So reports indicate a Liberian flag, so she's Liberian flagged, had been attacked approximately 152 miles northeast of El Doom, Oman. Reports by the UK's Ministry of Transportation office indicate an initial attack against an unarmed vessel occurred on 29 July at 7 o'clock UTC, Universal Standard Time. 86 nautical miles southeast of Al Doom. An additional report was later circulating indicating a second attack. Vessels were advised to avoid the area. What's is clear here that the first attack by this unmanned aerial vehicle deployed flares. So they basically lit them up. The second attack is supposedly have struck the bridge. Now, the use of drones with explosives has been going on for quite a while. You'll hear the term suicide drones. Let me be clear. If you've ever driven a drone, first off, they're all suicide drones. After a while, if you're not careful with them, they will fly into things. But in this case, they used the drone to pilot it into the bridge and detonate it. They had a crew on board the vessel of 27. It is a typical crew: Romanian, Russian, Chinese, Ukrainian, Filipino, Georgian, Indian. Supposedly killed two on board, a Romanian and a Brit. What's interesting there is the Brit, who was the Brit on board. You don't see many British officers on Liberian flagged vessels. We know this vessel did have a security detachment on board. Security detachments had been put on board vessels since the early 2010s in retaliation to piracy. However, this vessel, which is operated by Zodiac Maritime, is an Israeli-based company. Many of their ships have been targeted recently. And there's a good chance that this security team wasn't on board just to deal with piracy, but could also be dealing with drones, because we've seen numerous of these attacks taking place. I'm going to come over here to Zodiac Maritime. This is their statements they have out on it as of currently. So their very first attack that they had on here, we can confirm that there was a suspected piracy incident on board the product tanker, motor tanker Mercer Street. The ship is a Japanese-owned vessel, so she's owned by a Japanese company, managed by our UK-based Zodiac Maritime office. At the time, the incident of the vessel was in the northern Indian Ocean, traveling from Dar es Salaam to Fujairah with no cargo on board. We are in coordination. So a few hours later at 1300, the first report was at 7:30. This one's at 1300. With profound sadness, we understand that the incident on board Mercer Street has resulted in the death of 2 crew members, Romanian national, UK national. We are not aware of any harm to any other personnel. Other primary concern remain the safety and well-being of everyone on board, all those affected by the situation. Details of the incident are still being established, and investigation into the incident currently underway. Then the final report, an hour later, we can now confirm Mercer Street is sailing under the control of her crew and under her power at 14 knots to a safe location with a U.S. naval escort. So right now in the northern Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf, this is from USNI News. They have something called the Fleet Tracker, the Ronald Reagan, which is a nuclear aircraft carrier, and the Iwo Jima, which is an amphibious assault ship. Their 2 groups are in that area. They're monitoring the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so what you have in the area, let's scroll down here into the northern Arabian Sea right here. You have the Ronald Reagan, the guided missile cruiser Shiloh, the destroyer Halsey, all there, along with Air Wing 5 on board the Ronald Reagan. And then you add to it the Iwo Jima amphibious ready group there with the Carter Hall, which is a landing ship dock, and the San Antonio, which is a landing platform dock. All those vessels have capabilities and probably were being tapped right then to assist in the movement of this vessel. So this is Mercer Street right here. She's a product tanker. She was built in 2013, 182 meters long, 32 meters wide, basically capable of carrying about 28,000 gross tons. Remember, gross tons is volume. It's not exactly weight that you're talking about there. Displaces 60,000 tons. And if you start looking at her, basically her capabilities, she can carry quite a bit. She's a product tanker. So not a huge tanker, not a massive tanker at all, but a substantially good size tanker. She's under Zodiac Maritime. Again, this is a company that's owned by an Israeli billionaire. I'm not sure exactly how much money he has, but he has a lot of money. And Zodiac Maritime basically operates the vessels. They have entire fleets here of vessels they operate, container vessels right here. You'll see they do a lot of operating for a lot of ship companies. MSC are in there. Who else? Yeah, their Hyundai is in there. So you see a lot of vessels in here. They also have in here a lot of car carriers. These have been the ones that have been the target recently. We've seen a lot of attacks on car carriers recently, but in the case of Mercer Street, she is a tanker, tanker, and you'll see here on the list right here of a medium range tanker, Mercer Street. So that's the information we have on her right there. One of the things I found really interesting is this tweet came out from Michelle Bachman. She's with Lloyd's List. One of the very initial stories came out, and she's really frustrated, and I'm frustrated too, but the usual maritime stonewalling and silence approach be frustrating, which really it is. One of the things that we talk about all the time is why these companies don't talk more. Here's Mercer Street. Here's where she was, estimated position during the attack. Another great story. This one is by John Gambrell. John does a great job, always a great job. I've talked to John. I've been interviewed by him, and I've talked to him, and I read his stuff all the time. Does a great kind of breakdown on the attack right here. what happened. Again, he's talking about the London-based Zodiac Maritime, part of Israeli billionaire is a billionaire, AL Offer Zodiac Group. And again, they confirmed also that from Zodiac about the two fatalities on board. Uh, Goes on to here, a U.S. official speaking on condition of anonymity, always anonymity, discussed the ongoing investigation, told the Associated Press the attack appears to have been carried out by a one-way drone and that other drones took part. The official said it wasn't immediately known who launched the attack. These drones, if you think about drones, again, you can think about your garden variety drones that you use around your house or something like that. These drones are larger, bigger, but to sink a vessel the size of the Mercer Street, it's very unlikely. You have to get into missiles. You have to get into large explosive payloads, and drones tend not to have that. However, one of the things we've been seeing in conflicts around the world, particularly up in the area around Armenia and Georgia, which have been having fights, they've been using drones as anti-personnel weapons, basically find troops on the ground, fly the drone down, and explode it. And it sounds like in this case, they detonated it probably near the bridge or exposed area where they can get the crew. And so that's what we know so far on this story. Obviously, a horrific event right now taking place in the Gulf of Oman. So let's talk about the background. Why is Israel and Iran attacking their own ships or each other's ships, I should say? First off, this is not new. If you go back to the 1980s, we've seen incidents of this happening before. During the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were involved in what's called the Tanker War. This is a story that was in the USNI, U.S. Naval Institute proceedings on the history of the Tanker War by Ron O'Rourke. And Ron wrote this really great piece way back in May of 1988 for proceedings on the Tanker War. And one of the things I want to show you here is the number of attacks that were taking place. Iran and Iraq were involved in a war from 1980 to 1988. And what eventually happened was the war spilled over into the Persian Gulf. They started targeting basically tankers. Iranian tankers were targeted by the Iraqis. Iraqis had targeted Iranian tankers. And you'll see that right there. Iraq basically had their vessels being hit quite consistently by the Iranians. Iraqis at the time did not have a pipeline to get out through Syria and Turkey. So the Iranians began that, and there was a series of missile attacks, mining attacks, you name it. And it got pretty bloody pretty fast. This chart here has lots of data on it. So you see these Liberian ships being hit. Again, these were flag tankers. They're not like Liberian nationals on board. Panamanian, Cyprus, Greece. And then the thing that drew the United States into this, if you remember back into the late 1980s, was the Kuwaitis. The Kuwaitis started getting their tankers hit, and the Kuwaitis asked for assistance. And so they actually initially went to the Soviets first. And what that did is got the Americans riled up. It's like, why'd you come to us? And so the Americans eventually reflagged these tankers into the U.S. registry, and they started convoying them. The first convoy involved a ship called the Bridgeton. Bridgeton hit a mine, at which point all the Navy vessels got behind the Bridgeton because Bridgeton was a big, huge tanker and could suck up a mine hit. The Navy vessels couldn't. A lot of jokes. I know a lot of guys who were on the Bridgeton, and they joke about it being the world's biggest minesweeper. But they also joke about the fact that the Navy kind of ran behind them. Later, the Navy brought in minesweepers to do this right. But this conflict also involved in some pretty perilous times for the U.S. Navy. USS Stark was hit by Exocet missiles fired by the Iraqis, and Samuel B. Roberts had its back broken while in the Persian Gulf due to a mine hit. USS Vincennes shot down a unarmed civilian Iranian airliner. So it was a very nasty time period in the tanker war. But one of the things I want to clarify about the tanker war is the tankers never stopped flowing. They kept moving the entire time. You never saw a disruption in the flow of oil. Companies were willing and countries were willing to put up with this as long as the oil kept flowing. Yeah, it resulted in higher insurance rates. It resulted in the death of merchant mariners. But largely, most people didn't care. The only reason the U.S. got involved is because we reflagged the Kuwaiti tankers to the U.S. flag. That brings us to this story right now. The U.S. Navy, this is a story out of Al Arabiya, I'm going to say that, news. U.S. Navy has boarded the Israeli tanker. They keep calling it an Israeli tanker. And again, it's Liberian flag, Japanese owned, but the Israelis are the operating company that's overseeing it, Zodiac. But they have basically board it and they're escorting it out. I doubt that the Ronald Reagan is actually escorting it out. It's probably one of the Reagan ships, but the Reagan probably has air cover over it right now, and they're getting it out of the area to do it. I have got a little bit of feelings about this. A vessel that's attacked does get protection from any vessels in the area. I mean, if you're attacked, you should get the protection. I do have an issue with the fact that the U.S. kind of assumes the mantle here for protecting the world's trade all the time. This is, again, Japanese owned, Israeli backed company with a Liberian flag. The Liberian Navy's not coming out. We know that, but that's the reason people flag in Liberia, is because the Liberians don't have a navy because it's cheap. But Israel and Japan does. And so there's that issue. But the U.S. does have it protected by the Reagan battle group taking her out. So a couple other issues here as we go in. This story right here, I'm going to link it to. This is from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It talks about this undeclared war that's been going on between Iran and Israel. And they got some great information and also some great graphics right here, which I'll show you. So this is a map showing the recent attacks on vessels. Green shows you Iranian vessels, whereas the blue are Israeli vessels. And you'll see the kind of tit for tat kind of going on here with these styles of attack. So here's Mercer Street right here. Earlier this month, we've had the Lori, we had the Helios Ray, the Hyperion Ray, the Tyndall. All these vessels were subject to different styles of attacks, questions about their attacks. Meanwhile, the Israelis have been going against Iranian vessels, the Savas down here in the Red Sea, the Cord up here off the coast of Israel itself. And these attacks, as a matter of fact, they have it quantified here in a chart with a little bit more detail here for you to kind of look at to see. And that's all in that story. And you can link over to it and see the style of attacks that's going on. In very many ways, we're seeing a rehash of the tanker war, but on a much smaller level. I mean, they're not flinging mines and or planting mines and flinging cruise missiles at each other or surface to surface missiles. These are much more targeted, and especially with the drone attacks, we're seeing that take place. We've seen attacks on tankers coming out of the Persian Gulf a lot recently over the past few years, but nothing substantial enough to kill the vessel, to sink it. This is really the first instance we're seeing where people have been killed on board, and largely because of an explosive device close to the bridge. We're also, there's more here on the tanker war, which I'll include here for you, some more detail about it, including John's kind of talk back and relationship back to that when it took place back in the 80s, and are we seeing a modern day tanker war? The impact this is going to have, that's the great question here, and that's the next thing I want to kind of talk about. So when we talked about the tanker war of the 1980s, the flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf never stopped. It didn't. Tankers kept moving, and even though ships were lost, and there were ships lost, ships were burnt out, they were sunk, crews were killed, hundreds of merchant mariners died in these attacks, the ships kept moving. During the early 2000s, when piracy was hot and heavy off the east coast of Africa, ships kept moving. It didn't stop the trade. What did happen was a increase in insurance rates, not huge, not a lot, but an uptick in insurance rates. You're not going to see right now, for example, Zodiac and these other groups stop flowing ships. They're going to keep moving them. They're going to put more protection on board the vessels if they can. How do you stop a drone? Well, shoot them down. What are you going to do? Lots of times you put these riding crews on board vessels to interdict pirates, fire at them, but you can't go into a port with a armed vessel. So what happens is these ships will be met by vessels, boats outside territorial waters. The riding crew comes off with their weapons, and they wait for the vessel to come back out and get back on board and ride the vessel to protect it. And they'll call upon naval units. There are naval units in the Persian Gulf, in the northern Arabian Gulf, that they can call upon there. NATO, US, other forces there. The Chinese have forces there to guard against piracy, and you'll see them come on. There's several strategies for escorting. I wrote a piece for SimSec a few years ago where I talked about it. Basically, you either, take the firefighting policy, the policing policy, or the bodyguard policy. Firefighting policy is, you have some vessels stand by, and when they get attacked, you respond like you do from a firehouse. The policing policy is you send vessels out on patrol and try to find the guys, but that's not always working. And then there's the bodyguard policy, where you basically ride herd with a ship and you escort it, or you put these riding crews on board. And I think one of the things we're going to see here is how these companies, Zodiac, the Israelis, respond to this as Iran continues to tick this up, and they start using this level of asymmetric warfare here with drone attacks, limpet mines, attacks on vessels, trying to cause disruptions. Uh, it could have an effect. And again, one of the things we're seeing is this is not isolated either. The story I inadvertently put up before was a talk about a Houthi action, which is down in Yemen, down at the very southern tip of Saudi Arabia, attempts to attack a Saudi commercial ship. We've seen these attacks take place. The Houthi have attacked UAE vessels. They've attacked Saudi vessels. They even hit a Saudi frigate a few years ago with a remote control surface vessel with explosives on board, ran into its stern and exploded. These attacks have been taking place. Add this to what's going on right now with basically global trade. We just saw just literally today, a report came out that the price was someone was quoted a price of $32,000 to move a container across the Pacific. This is back when containers a year and a half ago were going for $1,500 across the Pacific. Now you're talking about $32,000. Add to it, we've seen issues with Indian crews not being allowed into China. We've got issues with outbreaks of COVID on board, and the entire shipping industry is really in a, I won't say perilous, but I would say it's in a precarious position where, it can only take a few things to really cause these butterfly effects to magnify and for more global disruptions to take place. We saw it with Ever Given with the 6 days in the Suez. And we saw the ramifications in Yanatan when Yanatan shut down. We're seeing right now a huge parking lot forming once again off Los Angeles, Long Beach. And these style of attacks, these asymmetric style of attacks coming from Iran against ships associated with Israel, have the potential to cause some destabilization. How do you stop drones? How do you stop small drones, large drones from coming in? And remember, drones don't have crews, and so shooting them down is that an act of war? Is it not an act of war? What is it? Does the U.S. start riding herd on these vessels? Do we start shooting down the drones? Do we start putting armed guards on board every vessel out there? It raises a slew of issues. When you start turning commercial vessels into armed vessels, you're creating armed vessels that are private men of war, privateers, as long as they're authorized by a state. If they're not authorized by a state, then they're pirates. And you knew we get the pirates sooner or later on the channel. And so now we're seeing that come about. So really interesting story on the Mercer Street. Going to keep following it along. A lot to break down there. Not exactly sure what's going to be the result. How does Israel respond to that? I don't know. Does Israel now target Iranian vessels? There's an Iranian vessel right now up in the Baltic Sea visiting Russia that had sailed all the way from Iran around Africa, the Maryak. Do they target her when she comes out? I would not be surprised if she doesn't have a huge bullseye on her when she's sailing back out of the Baltic Sea around Europe and Africa, heading back to Iran. Would not be surprised to see that happen. I think the Israelis will respond. And again, they're going to keep, especially now that you have the death of two nationals. How does the British respond with the British national? How do the Romanians respond with the Romanian national? That's NATO. How do they respond to that? I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. So hope you enjoyed the episode. Got learned a little bit about what's going on in the situation with the Mercer Street. If you did, please subscribe to the channel. Go ahead, hit that bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out. Go ahead, give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment. All those help share this video among YouTube. Also, feel free to share it on social media to your friends, family, and everybody else you know. So this is Sal Mercagliano signing off until our next episode of What's Going On with Shipping.